Washington District of Columbia, November 7, 1978. The morning fog clung to the Potomac River like a gray shroud, and Frank Donovan pulled his beaten-up Ford pickup to the curb outside a modest brownstone on 32nd Street in Georgetown. He expected nothing more than another routine plumbing job, another leaking pipe in another old house where the wealthy complained about inconveniences that most Americans would consider luxuries. The appointment card read simply, "Water damage, ceiling leak, second floor." He had no reason to believe this Tuesday would be anything but ordinary, but before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Frank was 53 years old, a Korean War veteran with thick forearms and permanent grease under his fingernails. He had been fixing pipes in the nation's capital for 27 years, long enough to know that Georgetown's elegant facades often hid rotting infrastructure. The brownstone before him stood 4 stories tall, its brick exterior recently sandblasted to reveal the warm red tones beneath decades of city grime. Black shutters framed tall windows, and a brass knocker shaped like an eagle gleamed on the dark green door. He rang the bell twice before a man answered. The resident introduced himself as Thomas Garrett, a cultural attaché with the State Department, or so his business card claimed. Garrett was perhaps 40 years old, with thinning brown hair carefully combed to disguise a growing bald spot, and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic air. He wore a cardigan sweater over a white shirt, despite the mild autumn weather, and his handshake was oddly formal, almost rehearsed. "The water is coming through the dining room ceiling," Garrett explained, leading Frank through a foyer decorated with abstract paintings and a Persian rug that probably cost more than Frank's annual income. "We noticed it yesterday evening. Just a small stain at first, but by this morning it had spread considerably." Frank followed him up a curved staircase, his toolbox clanging against his leg with each step. The house smelled of old wood and furniture polish, but underneath those familiar scents lurked something else, something chemical and foreign that Frank could not quite identify. They passed a living room, where a television played the morning news with the sound turned low, and Frank caught a glimpse of coverage about the Camp David Accords and the ongoing negotiations between Egypt and Israel. The dining room ceiling showed clear signs of water damage. A brown stain roughly 3 feet in diameter had spread across the white plaster, and in one corner, water had begun to bubble the paint. Frank set down his toolbox and pulled out a flashlight, shining it across the damaged area to trace the likely path of the leak. "I will need to access the bathroom directly above this room," Frank said, already calculating the probable culprit. "Most likely a toilet seal or a supply line. These old houses, the plumbing is original. Cast iron pipes from the 1920s. They do not last forever." Garrett nodded, his face showing what appeared to be genuine concern. "Of course, whatever you need to do. The bathroom is at the end of the hall upstairs. I have a meeting at the State Department in 40 minutes, but you can let yourself out when you are finished. Just lock the door behind you." Frank found this slightly unusual. Most homeowners preferred to hover nearby during repairs, worried about costs or curious about the work. But Garrett seemed eager to leave, already shrugging into a navy blue overcoat and collecting his briefcase from the hall table. He handed Frank a key to lock up, reminded him again about the meeting, and disappeared out the front door with an urgency that struck Frank as odd for a mid-morning appointment. Alone in the house, Frank climbed to the 3rd floor and found the bathroom. It was surprisingly plain for such an elegant home, with basic white fixtures and black and white hexagonal floor tiles. He knelt beside the toilet and immediately spotted the problem. Water had pooled around the base, indicating a failed wax seal. A straightforward repair, 30 minutes of work at most. He shut off the water supply and began removing the bolts that secured the toilet to the floor. The work required him to lie on his side, and as he wrestled with a corroded bolt that refused to budge, he heard a distinct sound from somewhere below. A door closing, quietly but definitely. Frank froze, listening. He had watched Garrett leave. The house should be empty. For several seconds he heard nothing but the hum of the refrigerator from the distant kitchen and the ticking of what sounded like an old clock. Then came footsteps, soft and careful, moving through the first floor. Someone was definitely in the house. Frank's pulse quickened. He thought about calling out, announcing his presence, but something stopped him. The footsteps were too cautious, too deliberate. This was not someone who had forgotten something and returned home. This was someone who believed the house was empty and wanted to keep it that way. Moving as quietly as his bulk would allow, Frank crept to the bathroom door and peered into the hallway. From his vantage point at the top of the stairs, he could see part of the second-floor landing, but nothing of the floor below. The footsteps had stopped. He waited, barely breathing, his mind racing through possibilities. A burglar? But how would they know the house was empty? And why risk a break-in in broad daylight in Georgetown, where neighbors noticed everything? Then he heard a new sound, metallic and purposeful. A key turning in a lock, but not the front door. This came from inside the house. Frank knew the sound well from his years of installing deadbolts and replacing door hardware. Someone had just unlocked an interior door. He made a decision that surprised him even as he acted on it. Instead of announcing himself or fleeing the house, Frank began to descend the stairs, placing each foot carefully to avoid the creaks he had noticed on his way up. His Korean War training, dormant for decades, suddenly flooded back. Move slow, stay low, observe before acting. He reached the second-floor landing and pressed himself against the wall, listening. The sounds came from what he remembered as a study, a room Garrett had walked past without comment when showing him to the dining room. Frank edged along the hallway until he could see through the partially open door. A man stood with his back to the hallway, working at a desk. He wore dark clothing and moved with practiced efficiency, photographing papers with a small camera that made almost no sound. Frank's throat went dry. He was witnessing something he should not be seeing, something dangerous. The smart move was to retreat quietly, leave the house, forget what he had seen. But curiosity and a stubborn sense of duty kept him watching. The man at the desk was not Garrett. This person was younger, perhaps 30, with black hair and a lean build. He worked with remarkable speed, photographing one document, replacing it precisely where it had been, then moving to the next. Frank shifted his weight, and the old floorboard beneath him protested with a loud creak that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. The man at the desk spun around, and for a frozen moment, the two men stared at each other. The stranger's hand moved to his jacket, and Frank saw something that made his blood run cold. A shoulder holster, and inside it, the unmistakable outline of a pistol. Frank raised his hand slowly. "I am just the plumber," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Mr. Garrett called me about a leak. I did not know anyone else was here." The stranger's eyes were dark and calculating. He did not remove his hand from near his weapon. "How long have you been standing there?" he asked, and Frank noticed the slight accent, something Eastern European buried beneath careful American pronunciation. "Just got here," Frank lied. "Just now. I heard a noise, thought maybe Mr. Garrett came back." The stranger studied him for several long seconds. Frank could see him making calculations, weighing options. Finally, his hand moved away from the holster. "You are working on the bathroom," the man said. It was not a question. "Return to your work. Finish quickly. You saw nothing here. Understand?" Frank nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. He backed toward the stairs, never taking his eyes off the stranger, and climbed back to the third floor. His hands shook as he picked up his wrench. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to continue working on the toilet. Running would confirm that he had seen too much, understood too much. Better to play the part of the oblivious tradesman. He worked faster than he ever had, replacing the wax seal and reinstalling the toilet in barely 15 minutes. When he tested the flush, he listened intently for sounds from below. Nothing. He packed his tools, his movements jerky with adrenaline, and descended the stairs on legs that felt like rubber. The study door was now closed. The house felt empty again, but Frank could not shake the sensation of being watched. He left his business card and a brief invoice on the hall table, locked the door as instructed, and walked to his truck with measured steps when everything in him wanted to run. Only when he was 3 blocks away, stopped at a red light, did Frank allow himself to process what he had witnessed. A man with a weapon and a camera, photographing documents in the home of a State Department employee. The implications were stunning and terrifying. He had stumbled into something far beyond a simple burglary. For the rest of that day, Frank tried to focus on other jobs. He replaced a garbage disposal in DuPont Circle and fixed a clogged drain in Adams Morgan. But his mind kept returning to the study, the camera, the man with the gun. By evening, sitting in his small apartment in Arlington, he had convinced himself that reporting what he had seen was both necessary and incredibly dangerous. The question was who to tell. The police seemed inadequate for what he suspected was espionage. The FBI, then. But how does a plumber walk into the FBI and claim to have witnessed spying? They would think him crazy, dismiss him as a conspiracy theorist caught up in Cold War paranoia. He needed proof, something concrete beyond his word. That night, Frank barely slept. He lay in bed thinking about Garrett, about the stranger, about the careful way the documents had been photographed and replaced. In the darkness, he made a decision. He would watch the house. If what he suspected was true, the stranger would return. Patterns existed in espionage as surely as they did in plumbing. Find the pattern and you found the truth. The next morning, Frank called his only scheduled appointment and rescheduled for the following day, claiming a family emergency. Then he drove back to Georgetown and parked on a side street with a clear view of the brownstone. He brought a thermos of coffee, a newspaper, and a camera of his own. A Kodak Instamatic he had bought years ago for a vacation he never took. The surveillance felt absurd at first. He was a plumber, not a spy. But the hours passed and Frank watched. Garrett left at 8:37 in the morning, briefcase in hand, looking every bit the bureaucrat heading to his government job. The house sat quiet until just after 10 o'clock, when a blue Chevrolet sedan pulled to the curb 2 houses down from the brownstone. Frank slid down in his seat, watching over the dashboard. The driver sat in the car for several minutes, apparently reading a newspaper. Then the stranger from yesterday emerged from the vehicle, glanced up and down the street with practiced casualness, and walked directly to Garrett's house. He did not knock. He produced a key and let himself in. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. He raised his camera and managed to photograph the man entering. Though his hands shook so badly, he doubted the images would be usable. The stranger remained inside for exactly 23 minutes. When he emerged, Frank took 2 more photographs before the man returned to the Chevrolet and drove away. For 3 more days, Frank maintained his vigil, the pattern repeated with minor variations. Garrett left for work each morning between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. The stranger arrived between 10 and 11, stayed for 20 to 30 minutes, and departed. On the 3rd day, Frank followed the Chevrolet when it left, maintaining a cautious distance through the Georgetown streets, until the sedan turned into the parking lot of an apartment building in Rosslyn, just across the river in Virginia. Frank noted the address and returned home, his mind spinning with questions. The stranger had a key to Garrett's house. He came while Garrett was at work. He photographed documents in the study. The only conclusion that made sense was one that Frank could barely accept. Thomas Garrett, cultural attaché at the State Department, was providing classified information to a foreign agent. On November 14th, 1 week after fixing the toilet, Frank walked into the FBI field office on 4th Street. He asked to speak with someone about a possible security breach involving a State Department employee. The receptionist regarded him with skepticism, taking in his work boots and flannel shirt, but eventually directed him to a small waiting room where he sat for 45 minutes before a young agent appeared. The agent introduced himself as Special Agent David Morrison, and he looked barely old enough to vote, let alone investigate espionage. He listened to Frank's story with an expression of polite disbelief, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. When Frank finished, Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied him with obvious doubt. "Mr. Donovan, you understand how this sounds," Morrison said gently. "You are a plumber who happened to see someone in a client's house, and from this, you have concluded that a State Department employee is a spy. Do you have any evidence beyond your observations?" Frank produced the photographs he had taken. The images were grainy and taken from a distance, but they clearly showed the stranger entering and leaving Garrett's house. Morrison examined them without much interest. "This could be anyone," he said. "A friend, a relative, a colleague. The State Department employee you mentioned, Mr. Garrett, Has he done anything overtly suspicious? Has he traveled to communist countries? Made unusual financial transactions? Frank shook his head, frustration building. I'm telling you what I saw. A man with a gun photographing documents while Garrett was at work. This happens multiple times a week on a schedule. That is not normal. Morrison set down the photographs and regarded Frank with something approaching sympathy. Sir, I appreciate your concern, but the Bureau investigates hundreds of tips every month. Most of them lead nowhere. Without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, without classified material actually being compromised, there is very little we can do. If you see something more definitive, please contact us again. Frank left the FBI office feeling both angry and foolish. He had expected dismissal, but the reality of it stung more than he had anticipated. He sat in his truck in the parking lot, weighing his options. He could drop this, return to his life, forget what he had seen. That was the sensible choice, the safe choice. But something stubborn in his nature refused to let it go. Over the following weeks, Frank continued his surveillance when he could spare the time. He documented 19 visits by the stranger to Garrett's house, always following the same pattern. He photographed the Chevrolet's license plate and noted that it was registered to a corporation that, when he looked it up at the library, appeared to exist only on paper with a registered address at a mailbox service. He also began researching Garrett himself. The public library had newspapers going back years, and Frank spent his evenings searching for any mention of Thomas Garrett. He found surprisingly little. A brief notice about his appointment to the State Department 3 years earlier, his name on a guest list for a diplomatic reception. Nothing that revealed anything about his background or his work. Then, on December 5th, Frank's surveillance routine was interrupted by an unexpected development. He was parked in his usual spot, watching the brownstone through a light rain, when a different vehicle appeared. A black Lincoln Continental pulled up directly in front of Garrett's house, and 2 men in dark suits emerged. They moved with an authority that immediately marked them as federal agents. Frank watched as they rang the bell and waited. When no one answered, one of them produced what appeared to be a warrant, and they let themselves in. They remained inside for nearly 2 hours. When they emerged, one carried a cardboard box, and the other held what looked like several file folders. They loaded everything into the Lincoln and drove away. Frank's mind raced. Had the FBI finally investigated? Had Morrison taken his report more seriously than he had let on? Or was this something else entirely? He waited for another hour, but neither Garrett nor the stranger appeared. Finally, as darkness fell, he drove home, confused and uncertain. The next morning's Washington Post provided an answer, though not the one Frank expected. On page 3, a small article reported that Thomas Garrett, a State Department cultural attaché, had died in a car accident on the George Washington Parkway late the previous evening. His vehicle had apparently left the road and struck a tree. The article noted that police were investigating, but believed weather conditions and speed were likely factors. Frank read the article 3 times, his coffee growing cold beside him. A car accident. How convenient. How final. He thought about the men in suits removing boxes from Garrett's house. He thought about the stranger with the camera. And he thought about how easy it would be to make a car accident look like an accident. For several days, Frank debated his next move. With Garrett dead, the investigation, if there had ever been one, would likely stop. But the stranger was still out there. And Frank had his photograph, his vehicle description, his license plate number. That information had to be worth something to someone. On December 12th, Frank returned to the FBI office. This time, he insisted on speaking with someone more senior than Agent Morrison. After much discussion and another long wait, he was shown to a different office, where a gray-haired man in his 50s sat behind a desk covered with file folders. The man introduced himself as Special Agent Carl Bennett, and unlike Morrison, he listened to Frank's story with focused attention. When Frank mentioned Thomas Garrett's name, something flickered in Bennett's eyes. "You are the plumber who came in last month," Bennett said. "Morrison mentioned your report in his notes. I am afraid we did not take it as seriously as we should have. Mr. Garrett's death has raised some questions, and we are taking a fresh look at his activities." Frank felt a surge of vindication mixed with dread. He laid out everything he had observed and documented over the past 5 weeks: the photographs, the license plate number, The pattern of visits. Bennett examined the materials with increasing interest. "This man you photographed," Bennett said, studying the grainy images. "Did you ever hear him speak? Did he have any distinguishing features, mannerisms?" "An accent," Frank said. "Slight, but there, Eastern European, maybe Russian. I only heard him briefly, but it was there." Bennett made a note, and then looked at Frank with an expression that mixed appreciation and concern. "Mr. Donovan, you have stumbled into a matter of national security. What you have observed and documented could be extremely valuable, but it also means you may have put yourself in considerable danger. The individual you photographed, if he is who we suspect, would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who could identify him." Frank felt ice in his stomach. The thought had occurred to him, of course, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way it had not been before. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now, we use your information to build a case," Bennett said. "But I need you to do something very important. You need to stop your surveillance immediately. No more watching the house, no more following anyone. These are professionals, and if they have not already noticed you, it is only because you have been lucky. Let us handle this from here." Frank agreed, though part of him felt frustrated at being sidelined. He had invested weeks in this surveillance, and now he was being told to walk away just as it seemed to matter. But Bennett was right. Frank was a plumber, not a spy. He had done his civic duty. The rest belonged to professionals. For the next 2 months, Frank heard nothing from the FBI. He returned to his normal life, fixing leaks and unclogging drains, trying not to think about brownstones and strangers with cameras. Then, on February 23, 1979, the Evening News reported a significant arrest. Federal agents had apprehended a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover in the Washington area. The individual, whose name was not released, had been conducting espionage operations for an estimated 3 years before his detection and expulsion from the country. Frank watched the news report with a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease. The broadcaster mentioned that the investigation had been aided by an alert citizen who had reported suspicious activity, but no names were given. Frank knew, sitting in his small Arlington apartment, that he was that citizen. His persistence, his stubborn refusal to let it go, had helped expose a Soviet spy. 3 days later, Agent Bennett appeared at Frank's door. He carried a briefcase and wore the same serious expression Frank remembered from their meeting. "May I come in?" Bennett asked, and Frank stepped aside to let him enter. They sat at Frank's small kitchen table, and Bennett laid out several photographs. "These are the individuals we arrested based on your information," he said. "The person you saw at Garrett's house was Viktor Sokolov, a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover as a cultural affairs officer at the Soviet embassy. He had been running Garrett as an asset for nearly 3 years, receiving classified information about State Department operations and personnel." "Was Garrett's death an accident?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. Bennett's expression darkened. "We believe Garrett realized we were investigating him. Rather than face arrest and prosecution, he chose another way out. The accident was staged to look like weather-related, but the evidence suggests otherwise. We will never know for certain, but that is our working theory." "And the information he passed along," Frank asked, "how much damage did it do?" "Considerable," Bennett admitted. "Garrett had access to personnel files, diplomatic communications, and assessment reports. The Soviets likely used this information to identify and recruit other potential assets. The full extent of the compromise will take years to assess, but your actions in reporting what you saw have prevented further damage. You should be proud of that." Frank did not feel proud. He felt tired and old and aware of how fragile the line was between his ordinary life and the shadow world of espionage that existed all around him, unseen and unnoticed until you accidentally looked in the wrong direction. Bennett reached into his briefcase and produced an envelope. "This is for you," he said. "It is not much, but it is our way of saying thank you. You did something most people would not have the courage to do. You saw something wrong and you reported it despite the risk to yourself." The envelope contained $500 in cash. Frank stared at it, unsure whether to feel insulted or grateful. $500 for nearly getting myself killed," he said with a weak smile. Bennett smiled too, though his eyes remained serious. Consider it compensation for the jobs you lost while conducting surveillance. And consider this, Frank. Most spies are caught not through sophisticated intelligence operations, but through ordinary people noticing things that do not fit, that feel wrong. You have that instinct. If you ever see anything else that concerns you, I hope you will call me directly." He left his card on the table, and they shook hands. After Bennett left, Frank sat alone in his kitchen, turning the envelope over in his hands. $500 and a business card. That was his reward for stumbling into the world of Cold War espionage. In the following weeks, Frank found himself scanning newspapers for any further details about the case. The arrests had been reported, but with minimal detail, standard practice for espionage cases where revealing too much might compromise other ongoing investigations. Viktor Sokolov had been declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States. Several other Soviet diplomats had also been quietly asked to leave, though no official accusations had been made public. Frank learned through Bennett, who called him occasionally to check in, that the investigation had uncovered a network larger than initially suspected. Garrett had not been Sokolov's only asset. The KGB officer had been running at least 3 other sources within the government, all of whom had now been identified and arrested. The damage assessment would take years, but the network had been gathering intelligence on everything from diplomatic negotiations to military technology. What surprised Frank most was how ordinary it all seemed in hindsight. No dramatic car chases, no shootouts, no Hollywood theatrics. Just a plumber who noticed something wrong and decided to do something about it. The real work of counterintelligence, Bennett had explained, was exactly that. Noticing anomalies, following leads, building cases brick by brick until the picture became clear. One evening in March, Frank drove past the brownstone on 32nd Street. A new family had moved in, and through the illuminated windows he could see children playing in what had been Garrett's study. The house looked warm and innocent, all traces of its previous owner erased. Frank wondered if the new residents knew what had happened there, if they had any idea that the home they now occupied had been a node in a Soviet espionage network. Probably not, he decided. That was the nature of this secret world. It existed in the margins, in the spaces between normal life, invisible unless you happened to look at exactly the right moment, from exactly the right angle. Frank had looked, and for a brief period, he had been part of something much larger than himself. By April, the case had faded from the newspapers entirely. New stories dominated the headlines. The Iranian Revolution, gas shortages, inflation. The Cold War continued, but its secret battles remained secret, known only to those who fought them, and to the occasional civilian who stumbled across something they were never meant to see. Frank returned fully to his work. He fixed pipes and repaired water heaters and unclogged drains. But he found that he looked at his clients differently now, wondering about their lives, their secrets, what might be hidden behind their doors. Georgetown's elegant brownstones no longer seemed merely picturesque. They were potential covers, possible safe houses, places where ordinary appearances might conceal extraordinary deceptions. He never spoke about the case to anyone except Bennett. Who would believe him anyway? His friends knew him as Frank the plumber, not Frank the spy catcher, and frankly, that suited him fine. He had no desire for recognition or publicity. The $500 sat in his sock drawer, still in its envelope. He could not bring himself to spend it. It felt like payment for something that should not be measured in money. In June, Bennett called with news. The FBI had recommended Frank for a commendation from the director. It would not be public, of course, but it would be noted in his file. Frank thanked him but said he did not need any commendation. Just knowing that he had done the right thing was enough. "That is exactly why you deserve it," Bennett said. "Most people who help us want recognition, want to feel important. You just wanted to stop something wrong. That is the best motivation we could ask for." The commendation arrived in the mail 3 weeks later, a certificate in a simple frame with an official seal and a signature from the FBI director. Frank hung it in his bedroom where no one but him would see it. Sometimes, late at night, he would look at it and remember that Tuesday morning when he had walked into a Georgetown brownstone to fix a leak and accidentally uncovered a spy. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his entire career fixing things that were broken, finding the source of problems and solving them. In a sense, that was exactly what he had done with Thomas Garrett and Viktor Sokolov. He had found the leak, traced it to its source, and called in the experts to fix it. The methodology was the same whether you were dealing with pipes or spies. Look for what does not fit. Follow the evidence. Trust your instincts. Years later, long after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed, Frank would sometimes tell the story to his grandchildren. They would listen wide-eyed as he described the stranger with the camera, the patient surveillance, the moment when he realized he had stumbled into something dangerous and important. The children would ask if he had been scared, and Frank would admit that yes, he had been terrified, but sometimes he would tell them, doing the right thing means being scared and doing it anyway. The brownstone on 32nd Street still stands today, occupied by people who have no idea of its history. The study where classified documents were photographed is now a home office. The bathroom where Frank fixed a toilet seal has been renovated twice. The house itself has been bought and sold, its ownership changing hands as Georgetown real estate values climbed steadily upward. But for Frank Donovan, that house remained frozen in time. Every time he drove past it, which was rarely as he aged and his territory shifted to other neighborhoods, he remembered that November morning. He remembered the sound of footsteps where there should have been none. He remembered the stranger's eyes calculating whether to kill him. He remembered choosing to act instead of looking away. That choice, he came to understand, was the real story. Not the espionage, not the arrests, not the international implications. The real story was that an ordinary man doing an ordinary job had seen something wrong and decided not to ignore it. In a city full of secrets, in a time defined by paranoia and suspicion, one plumber had noticed one anomaly and followed it to its conclusion. Frank Donovan retired from plumbing in 1992, his back finally giving out after 4 decades of crawling under sinks and lifting heavy equipment. He moved to a small house in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he spent his remaining years tending a garden and occasionally consulting on plumbing problems for neighbors who could not afford professional rates. Agent Bennett, who had become a friend of sorts over the years, visited him there once before Bennett himself retired. They sat on Frank's porch, drinking iced tea and talking about old cases, old times. Bennett mentioned that the Garrett case was still cited in FBI training as an example of how valuable civilian cooperation could be in counterintelligence work. "You changed the game that day," Bennett said. "Before Garrett, we were slow to act on tips from civilians. We thought we knew better, that our sophisticated intelligence methods would catch everything important. Your case taught us that sometimes the best intelligence comes from regular people who notice things that do not add up. We take civilian reports much more seriously now because of you." Frank appreciated the sentiment, but he knew the truth was more complex. He had been lucky. Lucky that he had noticed the footsteps, lucky that he had not been killed, lucky that his persistence had not been dismissed entirely. But luck, he had learned, often favored those who were paying attention. Frank Donovan died in 2003 at the age of 78. His obituary in the Fredericksburg paper mentioned his military service, his decades as a plumber, and his love of gardening. It did not mention Soviet spies or FBI commendations or Georgetown brownstones. That part of his life remained classified, a footnote in files that few people would ever read. But the impact of what he had done rippled outward in ways he never knew. The arrest of Viktor Sokolov had disrupted Soviet intelligence operations in Washington for years. Other spies, worried about exposure, became cautious or ceased their activities entirely. The network that Sokolov had built was dismantled, preventing who knows how much classified information from reaching Moscow. More importantly, Frank's actions had validated a principle that intelligence agencies sometimes forgot. Ordinary citizens, going about their ordinary lives, could be the eyes and ears that professional spies could never be. A plumber in a house saw things that satellites and wiretaps would miss. The challenge was creating systems where those observations were taken seriously, where someone like Frank could report suspicious activity and be heard. In the years since Frank's death, that lesson has been reinforced again and again. The 9/11 attacks, where flight instructors reported suspicious students. The Boston Marathon bombing, where store owners noticed unusual purchases. The countless plots disrupted because someone saw something that did not feel right and spoke up. The template for all of it, in a small way, was Frank Donovan and a leak in a Georgetown brownstone. The world of espionage has changed dramatically since 1978. Technology has transformed how intelligence is gathered and how spies operate. But some things remain constant. The importance of human observation, the value of civic responsibility, the reality that sometimes the most important intelligence comes not from sophisticated operations, but from ordinary people who refuse to look away when they see something wrong. Frank understood this, though he would have struggled to articulate it so grandly. He was a simple man who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous. He saw a leak and he traced it to its source. In his profession, that was simply good practice. That it happened to involve Soviet spies rather than faulty pipes was almost beside the point. The certificate from the FBI still hangs in what was Frank's bedroom, now belonging to the family that bought his Fredericksburg house. They do not know its significance, have never asked about the elderly man who left it behind. It is just one more piece of the house's history, as anonymous as the man who earned it. But in the archives of the FBI, in classified files that detail Cold War counterintelligence operations, Frank Donovan's contribution is recorded. His persistence, his attention to detail, his courage in the face of danger. These are the qualities that define effective intelligence work, whether conducted by trained professionals or by a plumber who happened to notice footsteps where there should have been none. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. The specific threats that Frank helped counter have been replaced by new dangers, new adversaries. But the fundamental truth he demonstrated remains. Security is everyone's responsibility. Vigilance is not just for professionals, and sometimes the person best positioned to notice something wrong is simply the person who happens to be paying attention. That is the real legacy of Frank Donovan, not the arrests or the disrupted network or the intelligence victory. The legacy is the example he set of ordinary citizenship in extraordinary circumstances. He was not a hero in the conventional sense. He did not perform acts of physical courage or make dramatic sacrifices. He simply saw something, reported it, and persisted when he was initially dismissed. In an era when that kind of civic engagement feels increasingly rare, when people are encouraged to mind their own business and not get involved, Frank's story serves as a reminder of what one person can accomplish by refusing to look away. A leak in a ceiling led to the exposure of a spy. A routine service call became a matter of national security. And a plumber became, for a brief moment in history, exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.